Okay, welcome to Unit 6, the beginning here. For me, Unit 6 has a lot of meaning because we start off with the beginning of the 20th century and, well, maybe a little bit into the 20th century by about 14, 15 years. And we'll start talking about World War I. And the meaning it has to me is because as a little kid, I knew World War I veterans. And so we're getting to a point here where you can almost relate personally, maybe not your generation as much, but sometimes I think we forget how young a nation we actually are. My grandmother, whose father was a World War I veteran, knew Civil War veterans when she was a kid. And you can imagine that those Civil War veterans as kids probably knew American Revolutionary War veterans. So in degrees of separateness, I mean, we're only I'm only probably 3 degrees from the American Revolution, which means you're only about 2 degrees actually away from World War I. So it's really not been that long ago, and it's getting us kind of into an era where we can start to relate a little bit because we've known some of these people. So let's get into the causes of World War I. Why did the world go to war? So we'll be, in brief, talking about the causes of World War I. And the most common way to do this briefly is to look at what led to the Great War as an acronym. And I like to use the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N. So we'll talk about the main causes of the war, and then the event that really lit the fuse, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Matter of fact, when I was in freshman taking world history and we were learning this, I don't know, I had a classmate who was struggling with this, and we made up a little rap to help remember the causes of World War I. And I don't remember any of it except one line. Let's give a hand to Franz Ferdinand. He's the Archduke of the Austrian beat, and that's all I remember. So I apologize that I can't entertain you anymore with my great lingo or rap skills. So let's keep going. MAIN stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And this isn't my favorite order to deal with these in, but we'll use it through the lesson to help you give you a hand remembering the acronym and its meaning. So militarism is exactly what it sounds like. The beginning of the 20th century was a time of great military buildup. The political scientists at the time felt that if a country was super strong, no one would dare attack it. Sound familiar? I mean, that's kind of the basis of the nuclear arms race and the buildup of the late 20th century. So Germany was experiencing the greatest military growth, and its navy was beginning to rival that of Britain. And so you can imagine, as Great Britain, you're a little bit nervous. And this led to both nations trying to outdo the other in an arms race. And this huge military buildup came at a time that war was still glorified in many ways. Nations saw war as a necessity to prove their might. And this attitude is even seen in some of the uniforms worn at the beginning of the war. Check out these guys. Their outfits make them look glorious while marching into battle, but it also makes them great targets. Alliances in theory are a great thing. And again, another political science theory that, it's like being on the playground. If you've got a lot of friends and if someone comes over to fight you, your friends will jump them. So if you have a lot of friends, people will tend not to fight you. However, the many alliances found just prior to the war emboldened nations to be bolder than they should have been. And then when their actions caused open conflict, their allies were dragged into it. Think of it like this. Russia's playing on the teeter-totter. Little Germany, who doesn't like Russia, comes over and shoves them off the teeter-totter. The thing is, Russia's little friend France, who doesn't even like to fight, now is honor-bound to step in and help Russia out. But you see, Europe in the beginning of the 20th century was a big playground. Britain even had a friend named Japan from a completely different playground. So everyone had a lot of friends, I mean allies. And all these alliances helped move the world to war. Imperialism, the I in our acronym, is when a nation works to expand its power and influence. And the two primary methods of imperialism are military conquest and political diplomacy, both of which we talked about in the end of the 19th century in our last unit. And it isn't a far stretch to see that the powerful nations of the world scrambling to build their influence through any means necessary could lead to war. Prior to World War I, the nations of Europe were working for dominance in Africa and Asia, and the competition for the markets and materials these regions could offer was fierce. Lastly, in our acronym MAIN is nationalism. And nationalism is basically an overabundance of patriotism, and nationalism was a big part of the buildup to the war. On the one hand, Nationalism fed into and was fed by imperialism. If you want to expand your power, well, how do you convince others to follow you? Well, look how great we are. All the nations of Europe wanted to show how awesome they were. And more directly, the Slavic people in Bosnia and Herzegovina desired no longer to be a part of Austria-Hungary. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was a huge group made up of many different ethnic and language groups, and the nationalistic desires of one of these groups led to the direct catalyst for the war, which was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the assassination of the Archduke is what really set off the war. It's a big powder keg. All these things are coming together to create the powder keg, but every powder keg needs a fuse, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the fuse that blows the powder keg. The Archduke was the crowned prince of Austria-Hungary, and he and his wife were shot by a Serbian nationalist, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. In response, Austria-Hungary declared war on the little nation of Serbia, who had provided Gavrilo Princip with the pistol. And this caused Serbia's ally, since the Serbs are Slavic people, the Russians, to ready for a fight. And in response to this, Germany, who was friends with Austria, declared war on Russia. And by the time all the dominoes fell, World War I was in full swing. Now, what is a powder keg, and what does it have to do with World War I? Well, in its most literal sense, a powder keg is, of course, a barrel of gunpowder. In times past, black powder was stored in wooden barrels, and these barrels or kegs were extremely sensitive, and a small spark could set off a huge explosion. The term powder keg has often been used figuratively to refer to the way a series of small events sets off something much larger. And in history, the term is most commonly associated with the events leading up to the Great War, also known as World War I. Historians often refer to pre-1914 Europe as a powder keg. And sometimes the term is used as a specific reference to tension in the Balkan region, just north of Greece, but more generally it applies to dynamics throughout the whole of Europe. Let's find out why. So when the Napoleonic Wars ended in the early 1800s, Europeans were weary of war. And throughout a good part of the 19th century, Europe enjoyed relative peace as a result. The Congress of Vienna, which convened in 1815, was instrumental in securing a peace that, for the most part, characterized 19th century Europe. Sure, there were a few regional conflicts like the Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War. There were also the revolutions of 1848, but generally, Europe experienced relative stability throughout the 19th century. Before 1871, the land that is now Germany existed as a loose confederation of independent kingdoms. But under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, these independent kingdoms were united following the Franco-Prussian War to form the modern nation state of Germany. And within a remarkably short period of time, the heavily industrialized Germany rose to the status of a world power and sought to exert itself as such. And this upset the long-standing balance of power in Europe. Which nations would Germany ally itself with? Which nations would Germany not get along with? And this new dynamic, coupled with the fact that Germany was embarking upon a plan of rapid militarization, led to tension throughout all of Europe. Turmoil in the Balkans also contributed to powder keg-like conditions. So just so we are clear, the Balkan region refers to the part of southeastern Europe where countries like Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, Serbia, and although it no longer exists, Yugoslavia and others are located. Now, most of these countries had and still have high percentages of Slavic people groupings. And for centuries, many Balkan states had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. But nationalism and Pan-Slavism caused many of these states to rebel against their Ottoman rulers, resulting in chaos throughout the region. Because remember, the Ottoman Empire is the old sick man of Europe. So what is Pan-Slavism? It was basically a movement aimed at uniting various Slavic peoples into one modern nation state. To exacerbate matters, Imperial Russia, who was sympathetic to Pan-Slavism and saw themselves as the defenders of the Slavic peoples everywhere, often encouraged Slavic groups to resist their Ottoman rulers. Now, we absolutely cannot discuss the pre-World War I powder keg without discussing the systems of entangling alliances that European countries found themselves in. Modern political scholars of the time saw the alliance system as a means to end wars forever, because who would attack you if it would draw a lot of players into the war? And these political scholars relied on Enlightenment thinking in the social sciences of political and military science to back up their claims that they could end war for good through science. In 1882, the Triple Alliance was formed. And this was a military alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Basically, to put it in our modern day terminology, it meant these countries had each other's backs. Now, to counter the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente was formed in 1907, composed of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And the implications of these competing alliances basically meant that if any one nation wins to war against another belligerent nation, all the nations would become involved. It's like two gangs, the Entente versus the Alliance. And if you're one member of the Alliance and someone attacks a member of the Alliance from the Entente, you're going to war against the Entente. So now we see why it's called a powder keg. Like players on a football team, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy were lined up on one side, with Great Britain, France, and Russia on the other. And the Triple Alliance is often referred to as the Central Powers, while the Triple Entente is often called the Allied Powers or just the Allies, even though technically they're not the Triple Alliance. It gets a little confusing. So when war broke out in 1914, the small country of Serbia aligned itself with the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia, while the Ottoman Empire aligned itself with the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So as you probably know, the United States joined the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, late in the war, but that is another lesson for another time. So more than any other single event, the spark that ignited the powder keg of Europe was the assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June of 1914. It was the spark that ignited the Great War. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the Kingdom of Austria-Hungary. He and his wife Sophie were shot to death again by a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist upset that Serbia was being imposed upon by Archduke Franz Ferdinand and wanted to see Serbia become its own country. Princip belonged to a terrorist organization called the Black Hand, whose aim was to overthrow the Austro-Hungarian government and establish a unified Pan-Slavic state. And the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is what provided a pretext for Austria-Hungary to invade Serbia, which led to the July crisis of 1914. Serbia is an independent little country, but the Slavic people that Austria-Hungary rules, they're not happy with Austria-Hungarian rule. They want to be part of this Pan-Slavic movement. Serbia wants to support them because they're Slavic, and so they start arming and funding terrorists for years in this area. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary, who owns the region, is trying to quell it, and without any success. So the July crisis was basically the diplomatic crisis in which the major European powers decided what to do about the conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Was this an internal conflict? Was this one that should draw allies in? And we don't have time to discuss the specifics here. We'll get into it later. But basically, political maneuvering and posturing ultimately resulted in a world war between the Central and Allied powers. Today, we're more than a century removed from the outbreak of the Great War, yet debate over who is to blame and exactly why the powder keg exploded is as fierce as ever. The question of the inevitability of the Great War is particularly pointed. Could the Great War, World War I, could it be avoided? Given the systems of entangling alliances in place, a lot of historians argue that it was nearly inevitable. They say if it hadn't been the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that sparked the war, it would have been something else. Others disagree, suggesting that cooler heads could very well have prevailed. And there's no easy answer to this question, nor is there any consensus among historians. Also at the center of the debate is the issue of responsibility. Is it Austria-Hungary's responsibility because they wouldn't allow the Slavic people to unite? Was it Serbia's responsibility because they were fomenting rebellion? Was it Russia's responsibility for just taking the actions of any Slavic state and saying they're right, you're wrong? Was it Germany's responsibility because they decided to declare war on Russia? So there's lots of things here going on. Which country or countries should be blamed for the outbreak of the war? Again, a matter of consistent debate. Over the years, there's been some consensus among historians that Germany, with its militaristic intentions, shares a heavy load of responsibility. Austria-Hungary and Russia are also runners-up, although it continues to be a matter of debate. So to give you an idea of what's going on in June of 1914 with this powder keg, as we move forward, I'm going to finish my lecture today and just show a brief video what I like about Unit 6 is we're getting into a lot more modern times, which means there's film, there's actual pictures of things that I can show you. So I'll try to get more into that. And this is actual film of the day, not the act itself, that wasn't filmed, but of the day that Franz Ferdinand was assassinated here. So I'm just going to go and make sure that we have the computer sound shared, and here we go.
It is in Sarajevo that the world's destiny changes forever. In Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary has annexed recently. But Serbia had opposed this move. It wants to expand by uniting the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian crown, together with his wife, has just escaped a first assassination attempt. They stop at City Hall to protest vehemently. These are the last images of the couple. When they leave the building a little later, they are shot dead with a pistol. The assassin, Gavrilo Princip, is a 19-year-old Bosnian nationalist. It was the Serbians who provided his pistol. This assassination in Sarajevo will have unimaginable consequences. Though at first, it is covered as a minor news story. The British paid scant attention to the black hole of Europe, known as the Balkan Powder Keg. In 1912, 2 Balkan wars had left 200,000 dead. By 1914, in Great Britain, those distant tragedies have been forgotten. The English monarch, George V, 49, is also the King of Ireland and the Emperor of India. His realm is huge, but his power's limited. His foremost preoccupation is Ireland's struggle for independence. On June 28, 1914, he writes, "The assassination in Sarajevo is one more shock for the old Emperor of Austria." George V has no sense of what is about to explode, any more than the President of France, who has come to London on an official visit to reaffirm the Entente Cordiale, the new friendship, which after centuries of deadly rivalry, now links Great Britain and France. Poincaré, 54, may be a moderate, but he comes from the Lorraine region that Germany annexed, and that all France now dreams of reconquering. July 3rd, 1914, with the funerals of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek, the countdown to war begins.
So a short clip, but hopefully you can see kind of what's going on right there in some living color and actually, as it happens. So hopefully I'll get to show a little bit more film as we go along here. So that'll conclude today's lecture. Tomorrow we'll get more into the initial stages and the beginning of World War I, and maybe even talk a little bit more about what's going on in Serbia there and things like that. So until tomorrow.